Check, 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 check. It's good. Is it high enough, you think? Like on my collar? Is it high? I got it high enough up here?
Should be fine.
Yeah, okay, cool. Hello. How's everybody doing? Cold, it is cold out there. So, this morning was pretty awesome. I sure do love a children's pageant. For me, it is not Christmas until we get to see a Christmas pageant. I mean, a children's pageant. So, it's official. We can celebrate Christmas now. It was true. They did a great job. And the man on the mic, or on the soundboard right there, is the one who put all that together for us on the video. I don't know if y'all have met Alex Arby yet. Alex is our new multimedia director and is doing an incredible job. Yes, he is. And if you were watching online this week, the cutting in of the Charlie Brown Christmas with my voice, that was really well done. And I told him, he asked me about that when we recorded it, and I said, man, if you got time to do that, that's fine, but don't kill yourself trying to do it. And so this morning I was here at the church, and Whitney called me and said, did you watch that? And I said, well, no, I'm doing other stuff. She's like, it was perfection. Alex is a genius. So he has the seal of approval of my wife, which is obviously very important to me, but she knows what she's doing. She knows what she's looking at. She's seen a few church-related things. AV online's okay? All right, you think?
We got a little static going on. Yeah, and reverb.
Staticky and reverby, yeah.
This morning at 8:45, I don't know if anybody else watched that service, but there was a lot of stopping and starting of the service period. And then the voice and the video got out of sync.
Yeah.
I noticed that.
Did you not enjoy it at the end? Mine was doing it from the very beginning, and it would stop, and it would load, and I'd have to go back out and come back in. So I don't know if it was just a personal issue. And other people in my Sunday school class who said they were experiencing the same problem.
Yeah. Well, normally starting and restopping, all that kind of stuff, normally that's on the user's end. That's not on the server end, like on the delivery end. But the only time I noticed that was at the very end of the sermon. It got off a little bit. Yeah. But okay. Well, while they're working on that, is there anything that you guys wanted to talk about before we get into Isaiah? This is our last meeting of 2020. Good riddance to 2020. Next time we get together is June 10th.
It's gun chases into 21.
Yeah, hopefully not too far though.
Well, the service this morning was wonderful. Love the children's pageant.
Yeah.
Giving them, the kids and the youth an opportunity to sing since we have no festival Christmas music this year.
Right.
And then the choir and the string quartet.
Yeah.
It was just great.
Yeah, the whole thing. Here in person, so when we showed the children's pageant instead of children's time, of course. And at the end, I was emotional. Because, what I said in the house at 11 o'clock is that, my job is not all that different. I prepare some stuff and I talk about it either to a camera or to a room full of people. Smaller room than normal, but whatever, it's the same process. But our children's ministries, our youth ministries, our music ministries, and our multimedia folks have just been really doing heroic work, I think, for 10 months now. And we're really blessed. I've got colleagues at other churches that just can't, they can't solve the streaming thing. It's just really, really hard. And we've had our bumps in the road, of course, too, but we just have a lot of really good people. Is it better? Okay. So anyway, I'm grateful for them. And then listening to that excerpt from Messiah, oh, geez, Kathy sounded great. And then when the choir came in, it was just really, really pretty special. And then you see out here in the hallways the remnants of our Santa experience, which was our replacement for Breakfast with Santa, which was really, really good. It really, yeah, Angie Rosowski and her team it was just awesome. So it was like a little glimpse of normality for our kids in a really tough year. So I'm grateful for that. Is it reverby in here? Are y'all in here? Okay, all right. It always sounds different to the person on stage. Okay, Isaiah. So it actually was pretty pertinent that we heard from Messiah this morning as we're reading Isaiah in the evening. Handel, much of the inspiration from Messiah comes from the prophecy of Isaiah. So prophets, this is the first time we've really dealt with a prophet, and we're going to be in the prophets for a while, because we're staying in the Old Testament for a little bit, because there's way more Old Testament books than New Testament books. And so we're doing Isaiah right now, and then I think we go Ezekiel and Jeremiah, or vice versa. I think it's Jeremiah and Lamentations and Ezekiel, and then we do the minor prophets in 2 batches. And so we'll be talking about these guys for a few weeks. After tonight, we're off until January 10th, but then when we resume on the 10th, we'll still be in the prophets for January. And there is I think what we have in the popular imagination about prophets is that they're in the business of telling the future, and that's absolutely not what biblical prophecy is about. So there's a terrific book, like the seminal book on this, and the scholarship is a tiny bit dated, but it's just, if you like this kind of stuff, this is Abraham Heschel's book on the prophets. And it's a little dated because he doesn't even really talk about 3rd Isaiah, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, but it's brilliant. And there's a phrase that he uses, and I've got these notes on my phone. Thank you to Whitney for texting this to me, because I forgot to pull it off the printer at home before I came in. He talks about, this is his quote, their breathless impatience with injustice. That's what the prophets are about. They are about calling Israel to live into or uphold or make good on their covenant responsibilities. That's what they're about. Now, it is the case that they talk about the concept of the day of the Lord, which is the final judgment. It is the case that a messianic expectation arises out of the writings of the prophets that, as Christians, we believe foretells the coming of Christ. But on their own terms, the prophets are about calling the people and their leaders to live up to their responsibilities to God. And that's going to be the theme that we're just going to be diving into in different flavors and iterations for the next several weeks. Of all the prophets, Isaiah is actually probably the toughest to talk about, but he comes first canonically, and so we're going to stick with our process here of dealing with the books in the order they appear in the Bible. But this is the most complicated of any of the prophetic books, and we'll get into why. But one of the things that makes the prophets tough to read is that they don't read like the rest of the books in the Bible. This is not like a gospel that tells you a story from beginning to end. It's not like the law, which, like Leviticus is a collection of rules, we get that, but the rest of the Torah, the first 5 books, are telling stories. It's not like the Psalms, which are just, we expect that to be a song book, and so we have 150 distinct chapters that become an entire collection, like a hymnal. What makes the prophets tough to read is that for me, is that it's a collection of oracles, which is a very specific kind of literature, and those alternate between oracles of doom and oracles of hope or redemption. And there's way more of the doom than there is the oracles of hope and redemption. So even in these different collections within Isaiah that we're going to talk about, it's not like they're organized in any kind of chronological way. I mean, in a broad sense they are, but you can't open the first 39 books or chapters of Isaiah and get a coherent narrative about who that prophet was. So they're hard to read, I think. Modern biblical scholarship is pretty clear that the book of Isaiah is the work of, is the product, let me put it that way, of three different distinct eras of Israel's history. The original Isaiah was an 8th century prophet. He lived in Jerusalem. He is obviously the actual historical character whose name the book carries. And he was, and this is not the case of every prophet, but in the case of Isaiah, the original Isaiah, it is the case that he was a kind of a member of the king's court. I mean, it was like an official position. There are prophets who are on the outside looking in and are kind of gadflies who call the leaders to account from outside power. And you can think of Martin Luther King Jr. would be an example of a modern prophet. But in Isaiah's case, he was a power broker. And what's interesting about these three distinct time periods that Isaiah deals with is how God speaks through the prophet and who the enemy is. So back in the old days, you would just assume that Isaiah was just all, I mean, it's a collection of oracles, so it's not like it tells one straight narrative anyway. But it's clear when you dissect the text that we're talking about three different people, and I'm hesitant to say people because the first Isaiah is the product of a person for sure. Second and third Isaiah are probably schools of thought, like schools of prophets working in the name of the person who inspired them to do their work. It's not a foreign concept for us at this point. We've talked about it a bunch throughout the Bible in 50, that you would have subsequent students of a teacher who write in his or her name. But here it's pretty clear based on the content. So first Isaiah, that's roughly chapters 1 to 39, and I've got the little tilde in there because as with everything else in biblical scholarship, we can't really say anything with precision until we get to heaven and ask these guys ourselves. So he was an 8th century prophet who lived in Jerusalem. Judah's enemies at this point, at this stage of Judah's history, like the terms even get a little bit confusing. So you had the southern kingdom in the south, you had the northern kingdom in the north. Northern kingdom is Israel, southern kingdom is Judah. Jerusalem is in Judah, Isaiah is working in Judah in the southern kingdom, and the enemies in this first part of Isaiah are the Syrians and Israelites, because Israel sides with Syria in attacking Judah. So this is kind of a civil war almost. And then the big bad person on the block was Assyria. That was the kingdom north of Syria. And that is the empire that conquers Israel in the north, takes them into exile, and Israel never exists again after that conquest in 722. So it's during that, that's the late 8th century, the way you count the centuries, since it's before the Common Era. And in first Isaiah, we actually do get a little bit of historical narrative mixed in with some oracles. And we're going to read some, as I mentioned last week, we'll be doing a kind of a survey of these different eras. Second Isaiah is roughly chapter 40 to 55. This prophet or this school of prophets were doing their work. For discussion's sake, we'll just say 2nd Isaiah was a person, but it's not entirely clear that that's the case. But 2nd Isaiah was in Babylon during the exile. So the enemies of God's people then were the Babylonians. The Babylonians were the ones who carried off Judah into exile beginning in 586 BC. So 1st Isaiah, if this is left to right chronologically, so 1st Isaiah is in the late 700s, and that means like 730, 720, 710, 700, in that era, when the main enemy was Assyria, but also the northern kingdom, Israel. Then you jump forward like 150 years. 2nd Isaiah is written during the exile, which began in 586 BC and ended in 537 BC, depending on how you count, in that 50-year period. And then 3rd Isaiah was written after Israel was allowed to return. This is why the terminology is tricky. God's people were allowed to return to Jerusalem, to Judah, the old southern kingdom, and rebuild. And at that point, that's roughly chapters 56 to 66, the enemies then were not foreigners. It wasn't the Assyrians and it wasn't the Babylonians. It was internally. It was people, the enemies were people who were, syncretists means people who were incorporating the worship of other gods into their religion. So that's a no-no. That's always been a no-no, but it was a real problem when God's people were allowed to resettle in Judah that had been kind of pagan basically for a couple generations. And also, in addition to people who were absorbing other cultures and other religions, the other issue were the leaders that were oppressing the people who had come back, whether that was economically or politically. So the themes, regardless of what era we're talking about, are pretty consistent. And these are the themes that are going to be pretty consistent for all of the prophets that we read, no matter their setting. Number one, calling the people back to their covenant responsibilities, first to God, and that means, number one, don't have any other gods before God, right? That's in the top 10 commandments. And number two, don't rely on foreign allies for your survival. Like, God's going to make sure you survive. This comes up over and over again. The other major covenant responsibilities, obviously, are to each other. So we can't exploit one another, we can't oppress one another. And this specifically is most often a financial exploitation of those who do not have, the poor, by those who do have, whether that's the rich or the politically powerful or the religiously powerful. Those are the themes we're going to hear over and over again. And the alternating message of the prophets are that God's going to judge those who do not live up to their covenant responsibilities, but there will also be some kind of redemption. And sometimes that judgment is temporal, like the Israelites, the northern kingdom, the ones who had turned on Judah and allied themselves with Syria. Ultimately, they're destroyed forever by the Assyrians. That's a temporal judgment. In the exile, that was perceived to be punishment for a lack of fealty to the covenant responsibilities. But also there is this concept that begins to emerge in the writings of the prophets of the day of the Lord, so the final judgment, which continues to be part of Judeo-Christian theology to this day. It becomes a thing under the prophets. But judgment is not the end of the story. There is always hope for redemption in some form or fashion. Okay? Does that make sense? A couple of interesting notes. They're on the bullet points there. So in 1st Isaiah, God speaks of Israel in the third person. 2nd Isaiah, God speaks to Israel directly. And 1st Isaiah is very much, y'all better watch out or this is what's going to happen. Or, well, Judah better watch out or this is going to happen, just like what happened to Israel. By the time that we're in the exile, it's God speaking words of comfort to us. And it continues in 3rd Isaiah, second person. The other thing I wanted to point out, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this, but in 1st Isaiah 1 to 39, that's the most confusing collection in terms of organization, because those oracles in 1st Isaiah cover basically 3 different periods, and we're not going to get in the weeds on the history of this, but one of those periods is what's called the Syro-Ephraimite War. In first Advent 1, I talked about this a little bit. When we read Isaiah 9, for unto us a child is born, that is in the context of the Syro-Ephraimite War, and that's when Syria and Israel allied to attack Judah. The second set of oracles is this period where, so anti-Assyrian agitation against Sargon II is my note there. That's where Israel began to push back on Assyria, and from a distance, Isaiah in Jerusalem saying, that's a bad idea. You're poking the bear. Stop messing with the Assyrians. That's going to end badly, and it does. And then the last set of oracles are when Hezekiah, who was a king in the south, the last king under whom Isaiah prophesies, when he revolts against the Assyrians, instead of just paying them taxes, like that's the way it worked oftentimes. So if you were not conquered in the ancient world, you could basically pay protection money to more powerful kingdoms, and that was the arrangement under which Judah existed after the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians. And Isaiah's point is just keep doing that. Just keep paying off the Assyrians. Don't poke the bear. And Hezekiah decided to poke the bear. And so that ends up badly for a time for Judah, although Judah is not conquered by the Assyrians. Listen, I know that's a lot of history, but all of that's going on in these 39 chapters of oracles that are all kind of mixed up make it a little tricky to read. So it's from this mishmash of prophetic oracles that, it's not ironic, but it's interesting. It's from those oracles that we begin to see the prophecies that we as Christians read to be Christ. This messianic expectation. Because in the context of this turmoil, people are hoping for a king that would finally be a good king. Like, we don't have a great track record in our faith history, Israel and Judah, of raising up kings that are good at their jobs, keeping the people safe, and living up to the covenant. Most kings are bad. This is something that was warned about early in the Old Testament. And so the hope emerges that there will become that God will raise up a righteous king in not just the example of David, but in the lineage of David, who will deliver God's people. And I'm sure you guys know this. When Jesus was born, that messianic expectation was particularly fervent, and the belief was it was going to be an earthly ruler that would throw off the rule of the Romans, like an earthly king who would deliver God's people politically. The twist in the story, we believe, is that it was a much more spiritual battle than that. Okay? So that's a whole lot of introduction before we read anything. I'm going to pause there. Any thoughts, any questions? Is that clear as mud? Mm-hmm. So keep in mind Abraham Heschel's phrase, breathless impatience with injustice. That's what defines a prophet. Okay, let's go to Isaiah 2. Spend a little bit of time in 1st Isaiah. Okay, the word that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Prophetic vision. In the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains,
and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Israel, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So this is Isaiah's vision of what's called the peaceable kingdom. And he unpacks it a little bit later on. But in an era that's defined by foreign conflict, you could see where a vision of a peaceable kingdom led by Israel would be a very compelling one. All right, let's jump ahead to chapter 5. And the reason I'm jumping ahead to chapter 5, this is the Song of the Vineyard, and this is something that Jesus will reference obliquely in the Gospels. He didn't come out and say, as Isaiah said, but he does reference it. And Isaiah is an incredibly influential book in the New Testament. It's the sixth longest book in the Bible by word count, so there's a lot of content here. And because of the breadth of Isaiah's work, he's not talking about a specific issue to a specific time, like Amos and Micah when we get to them. He's talking, this covers a whole lot of territory, and it's got some judgment in it. It's got a vision of a peaceable kingdom. It's got the idea of a child who will be raised up to lead them. He's got this very comforting extended section and this overwhelmingly optimistic extended section. And so the New Testament authors, the earliest theologians of the church, saw in Isaiah all of these connections to Christ. And I'm going to point out a really important one when we get to 2nd Isaiah. Jesus himself, according to the Gospel of Luke, begins his public ministry by opening up the prophet Isaiah and reading Isaiah 61. I mentioned that this morning in the sermon. And saying that in him, in his ministry, the prophecy of Isaiah will be fulfilled. So it's not just that other theologians looked and saw in Jesus what they believed was the prophecy of Isaiah come to fruition. He himself, at least according to Luke, identified himself as a fulfillment of one of these prophecies. So the Song of the Vineyard, I think some of this is going to sound familiar. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with clear vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard than I have done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? Wild grapes are not what you're looking for. So this is God who has nurtured and cultivated this people that God expected to bear a particular kind of fruit, and that's not the fruit those people are bearing because they're not living up to their covenant responsibilities. And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed. It shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. But I will also command the clouds, and I will also command the clouds that they rain no more rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed. He expected righteousness, but heard a cry. Ah, you who join house to house, who add field to field until there is room for no one but you. Are you left to live alone in the midst of the land? The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but one bath, and a homer of seed shall yield a mere ephah. Ah, you who rise early in the morning in pursuit of strong drink, who linger in the evening to be inflamed by wine, whose feasts consist of lyre and harp, tambourine and flute and wine, who do not regard the deeds of the Lord or see the work of his hands. Therefore, my people will go into exile without knowledge. Their nobles are dying of hunger, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore, Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure. That's the place of the dead. The nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude go down, her throng and all who exult in her. People are bowed down, everyone is brought low, and the eyes of the haughty are humbled, but the Lord of hosts is exalted by justice, and the holy God shows himself holy by righteousness. And the lambs shall graze as in their pasture, fatlings and kids shall feed among the ruins. Ah, you who drag iniquity along with cords of falsehood, who drag sin along as with cart ropes, who say, let him make haste, let him speed his work that we may see it. Let the plan of the Holy One of Israel hasten to fulfillment that we may know it. All you who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Ah, you who are wise in your own eyes and shrewd in your own sight. Ah, you who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant at mixing wine, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of their rights. Therefore, as the tongue of fire devours the stubble, and as dry grass sinks down in the flame, so their root will be rotten, and their blossom go up like dust, for they have rejected the instruction of the Lord of hosts, and have despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Breathless impatience with injustice. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them. The mountains quaked, and their corpses were like refuse in the streets. For all this, his anger has not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. He will raise a signal for a nation far away, and whistle for a people at the ends of the earth. He's talking about the Assyrians now. Here they come, swiftly, speedily. None of them is weary. None stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps. Not a loincloth is loose, not a sandal thong broken. Their arrows are sharp, all their bows bent. Their horses' hooves seem like flint, and their wheels like the whirlwind. Their roaring is like a lion. Like young lions they roar. They growl and seize their prey, and they carry it off, and no one can rescue. They will roar over it on that day like the roaring of the sea, and if one look to the land, only darkness and distress, and the light grows dark with clouds. So that's kind of the way the prophets read. And most of their oracles are oracles of doom. And the theme is, it's always the same. It is not about telling the future. It's about pointing out the fact that God's people are not living up to their covenant responsibilities. And sometimes that anger is directed at the people, and sometimes that anger is directed at the leaders. I would say oftentimes we can interpret that it was directed at the leaders, but the consequence is the same, judgment, either here or hereafter or both. Okay, this is a very famous, chapter 6 is very famous, so I want to go ahead and read that. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. This is the inspiration for that hymn that many of us love. And he said, "Go and say to this people, keep listening but do not comprehend. Keep looking but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull and stop their ears and shut their eyes so that they may not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and comprehend with their minds and turn and be healed." Then I said, "How long, O Lord?" And he said, "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until the Lord sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. Even if a tenth part remain in it, it will be burned again like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump." So clearly, that's the call of Isaiah, and clearly Isaiah sees his commission as being an oracle, a preacher of judgment. So, Merry Christmas, I guess. I mean, the later stuff, there's like plenty of things that are coming. For instance, next chapter, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel." Well, that sounds pretty familiar. Matthew will pick up on that in Matthew's gospel. And then in the 9th chapter, we hear this wonderful thing: "For a child has been born for us, a son given to us, authority rests upon his shoulders, and he's named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." So what Isaiah is talking about here is the raising up of a righteous king who will lead God's people back to their covenant responsibilities, that he sees it as his responsibility to point out that people are not following. So what's needed in this vision is a king who will be the right kind of leader. Now, what the early church does is to read back into 1st Isaiah and see Christ. So when we, some of the, like Handel's Messiah picks up on a lot of these passages from Isaiah, the image of the peaceable kingdom, and "for unto us a child is born." So we know that part of the story. But that's Christian interpretation of these texts. So much of 1st Isaiah is just like that. And I want to go ahead and move on to 2nd Isaiah, but any questions, any thoughts about that before we move on? Everybody good online? Okay, let's jump ahead to Isaiah 40. So at this point, not only has Israel indeed been conquered by Assyria, there's been a new big bad bully on the block rise up in Babylon. They have now conquered the southern kingdom, carted most of us, certainly all the leadership, off into exile where we've been living. And that, it is just impossible to overstate how traumatic that is for people who believe that God has a specific location, like God lives in the temple. And so much of our so much of our theology was connected to the temple, that when Jerusalem was conquered and the temple was raised, all of a sudden, we as God's people needed to rethink how we're relating to God. Covenant is clearly the thing. The locus of religious life shifts from sacrifice in the temple to worship in the synagogue. And we see that, we read some of that in Ezra and Nehemiah last year. The temple will be rebuilt and sacrifice will become a thing again. But in this interim time, everything has been turned upside down. And so instead of being like one doom oracle after another, all of a sudden what we get in 2nd Isaiah is really comfort. And actually in 40 it begins that way. "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God." Talking to Israel now. "Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." It's all good. It's all even. Your sentence has been fulfilled. A voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. We're going to hear this in John the Baptist in the New Testament. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill shall be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice says, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? All people are grass. Their constancy is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good tidings. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings. Lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. Like, you can just hear the tones. I mean, I'm reading it differently, but the words, like the content of the theology is very different than all those doom oracles in 1st Isaiah. And that theme carries throughout. Let's just jump at the end of that chapter to verse 27 of that 40th chapter. It's a good funeral text in here. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord, and he's talking to a people who have waited for 50 years in exile, those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. That's awesome. And that is, I wasn't kidding, that's a recommended Old Testament lectionary text for funerals. I've read that at a lot of funerals. So in the midst of this very comforting passage, these 16 chapters, 40 to 55, there are these enigmatic songs called the servant songs, or the suffering servant songs. And what's interesting about the servant songs is, just like in 1st Isaiah, the promise of the baby, the promise of the righteous king being raised up, the young woman who shall have a baby and name him Emmanuel, we read that as being about Jesus' birth. In 2nd Isaiah, which is the comforting section, there are these 4 servant songs that deal with redemptive suffering. Like the notion that undeserved suffering can be redemptive. And who do we identify with that? Christ, right? I mean, this is the cross and the resurrection. So in 1st Isaiah, we get images about his birth. In 2nd Isaiah, we get these songs in which we clearly see Christ. Now, 2nd Isaiah himself probably saw Israel as the servant, probably. Although lots and lots of commentaries have been written about the identity of the suffering servant. Because the reality is, if you have an entire group of people taken into exile, they didn't all deserve to go to exile, right? I mean, it's not just the king that goes to exile, it's all this collateral damage that goes with them. And so 2nd Isaiah offers a vision where the undeserved suffering of those who didn't bring on the exile is seen as being redemptive for the world. And of course we read that and see Jesus, hear echoes of Christ's ministry. So I'll give you an example. So 42 is the first suffering servant song. And I've got those listed there. That says 43, it should say 41. It should say 42. So if anybody wrote that down, suffering servant, it's not 43, it's 42. So here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching. That's the first suffering servant song. Now go to 49. First 6 verses of 49 are the second suffering servant song. Listen to me, O coastlands, pay attention, you peoples from far away. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow in his quiver. He hid me away, and he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity. Yet surely my cause is with the Lord, as my reward with my God. And now the Lord says, who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, so that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. He says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation shall reach the ends of the earth. In 50, beginning in verse 4, so the next chapter, verse 4, the third servant song. The Lord God has given me the tongue of a teacher, that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word. Morning by morning he wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught. The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious. I did not turn backward. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting. I mean, this sounds like the road to Golgotha. The Lord God helps me, therefore I have not been disgraced. Therefore I have set my face like flint, and I know that I shall not be put to shame. He who vindicates me is near. Who will contend with me? Let us stand together. Who are my adversaries? Let them confront me. It is the Lord God who helps me, who will declare me guilty. All of them will wear out like a garment. The moth will eat them up. And then the fourth one is in 52, beginning in verse 13. And this one will probably sound the most familiar. This one actually is cited in the New Testament. So 52 verse 13. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond any human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals, so he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which he had not been told them, they shall see, and that which they had not heard, they shall contemplate. Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We could keep going, but I'll stop there. No, I'll tell you what, let's jump down to 10. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. I mean, that's, you can hear it, right? I mean, there are direct citations of various of the verses from those 4 songs in the New Testament. There are also allusions to it without being direct citations. And so when we read those passages as Christians, I mean, it's pretty clear to us who he's talking about. One last thing, and then we'll stop. I'm going to just jump into 3rd Isaiah real quick and point out to you what I know you've heard before in chapter 61. We could just go to Luke and read the same text.
Donna asks, or no, she makes a comment that says, I read a long time ago that Isaiah named his 2 children with prophetic names, Shir Jeshub,
Yep.
and a remnant shall return,
Yes.
and Meher Shamal Hash
Yes.
at Haste to Spoil. Interesting, don't you think?
Yeah, so yes, that is interesting, and the prophets will do that a bunch. So there are prophets, let's just say it wouldn't be the best, like preachers' kids have a tough enough job, but being the kid of a prophet would be even worse, because they're constantly naming them like weird things, and they're marrying, how do I want to say this? Well, you know, like, they will, with their lives, whether that's through marriage or relationships or actions in the streets, they will act out the theology they're proclaiming. So if if a prophet thinks that Israel is being unfaithful to God, they will marry a woman who has been unfaithful with language that's very offensive, to make a point about how Israel is being, and then his job as the prophet is to redeem this person. But same with kids, and it's like this. They're so often, it's this phrase. I love it. Breathless impatience with injustice. They communicate that with their words and with their lives. Jeremiah will do some crazy stuff we'll talk about next time we meet, January 10th. Some of the minor prophets do similar things. So, verse 61, what happens in Luke 4, so at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, he sits down in the synagogue, he takes the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and he reads this text. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then it goes on, in the day of vengeance from our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for all who mourn in Zion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he stops at that, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he says, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And he sits back down. That's right before they try to throw him off a cliff. Because they're like, who do you think you are? We know you. You're Joseph's kid. I've got my study Bible that I've got a lot of Bibles, as you might imagine. And I like to get new devotional Bibles every once in a while. I've got devotional Bibles for all different kinds of occasions and theological emphases, and some of them are better than others. The one I've got on my Kindle is the Daily Meditation Bible, and it starts, the way it organizes itself is it starts in Genesis, goes all the way to Revelation. And I am in Luke now. You could theoretically read it all in a year. My schedule doesn't allow me to do that always. So it's taken me a couple years to get through this. But reading the Bible start to finish, the downside of doing it, like the upside is you get it in canonical order, and I think that's instructive, that's the way the church decided to put it together. The downside is you bog down in these long sections of Scripture. Like, oh God, reading Proverbs for like 4 days in a row is a beating. And I feel the same way when I get to the prophets. Not because they don't have really important things to say, but because they are, in fact, exhausting. They were exhausting to the people with whom they were in ministry. That shows up in the way many of their lives turned out. And they are laser focused on calling people out for their wrongdoing. And the stories are not organized in such a way that we are all used to reading stories. Isaiah is an extremely complicated book, but it's so crucial to the Christian message because in every section we see the ministry of Jesus. I'm going to use the word foretold, even though Isaiah could never have imagined Jesus of Nazareth when he wrote, right? I mean, these Isaiahs were writing in particular context. They were inspired by God. They could not have understood what the Holy Spirit was saying through them to future generations. But it's so central to the way we think of Jesus' ministry that it's worth diving into. But I think a better way to dive into it is through a book like this, because it's written as a narrative, and he pulls out the relevant oracles that can help explain what he's talking about. We intentionally are going to be in the prophets for a while because that's the order of the text. And we're going to hear these themes over and over again. And I think by the time we're done with the prophets, it'll be pretty clear that the whole concept of social justice is just kind of part and parcel to where this text leads us. Every generation has dealt with its own version of the struggle for justice. Like, I don't mean law and order, I mean justice like the way God construes it. And it's a powerful thing to hear it repeated throughout Israel's history. So Isaiah is the first example canonically. He's not the earliest of the prophets. We'll talk about the earlier ones later. But he's an example of one that speaks a crucial word to his own time that is reinterpreted centuries later in a way that still guides all of our lives today. It's pretty powerful stuff. Yeah, I'll repeat it.
James asks, how do present-day Jews interpret Isaiah, and are they still waiting for a Messiah that the Isaiah describes?
So the question is, how do modern-day Jews interpret Isaiah, and are they still waiting for the Messiah? So we probably should nuance that. I'm not an expert on Judaism, but there are many different branches of Judaism. Some, the Reformed Jews, Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews. And then just like with Christianity, they've got kind of their own political alignments that affect how they read the texts. I would say, I think it's accurate to say that they do not believe the Messiah has come yet. Yeah. And I've never talked to a rabbi who didn't have, or just a Jewish layperson, who did not have a very high regard for Jesus, but as a good Jewish boy, who was a rabbi and a teacher whose followers misinterpreted his identity. So we just have to agree to disagree on that. But the ethos of Jesus' ministry is very much a prophetic one, at least as highlighted by Luke. I mean, that shows up in all four of the Gospels, but Luke talks about that more than any other. So I'm going to close today with this poem by James Allen, right, from 1926. You may have heard it. It's the first time I heard it, we were visiting my mom and stepfather in St. Louis one Christmas. This is before we had kids, so it was a few years ago now. And they took us to the Rockettes traveling show. And the end of the Christmas spectacular, or whatever they call it, is a living nativity. Has anybody here seen the Rockettes Christmas show? And it was the living nativity is just a standard, I think, in all the shows. Is that what you remember? Yeah. And the narration as the nativity is being assembled is this poem called One Solitary Life, which is just, really moving to me. So this is how we'll close before Christmas, which is Christmas Eve is 11 days away. And I'll try to get through this without getting emotional, but man, this is good stuff. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another obscure village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. He never wrote a book. This kind of stuff really gets to me. I don't know. This time of year just makes me kind of sappy in general. So anyway, he never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never went to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things usually associated with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today Jesus is the central figure of the human race and the leader of humankind's progress. All the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that have ever sailed, all the parliaments that have ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned put together have not affected the life of humanity on earth as powerfully as that one solitary life. Amen. So, Merry Christmas. I love our time together. I really appreciate y'all being here. Appreciate everybody online. Have an awesome holiday season. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will pick back up on January 10th. Thanks, y'all. God bless you. Oh, sweet. Thank you. Thanks.